The first morning. The sun hasn't broken over the horizon yet, but inside the Connolly unit in South Texas, morning has already started. Not with light, but with sound. Metal doors slam in sequence, one after another, echoing down corridors that stretch longer than city blocks. The rhythm is mechanical, predictable, but beneath it is something else. The low hum of voices, the shuffle of boots on concrete, the occasional shout from a guard tower that cuts to the pre-dawn cold like a blade. This is a place where time doesn't move the way it does outside. Here, a year can pass in a week, or a single hour can stretch into something unbearable. The men who walk these halls have learned to measure their lives not in days, but in moments. Moment of silence, moment of confrontation, moments when a wrong glance can mean everything. In the center of one of the main pods, a young man sits on the edge of his bunk. His name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that he's been here 72 hours, and he still hasn't figured out the rules. Not the ones written in the inmate handbook. Those are useless. He's trying to learn the real rules. The ones that decide whether you eat in peace or whether you get tested. The ones that decide whether you're alone or whether you belong. He watches the other inmates move through their routines with a precision that feels rehearsed. Some head to the showers. Others gather near the day room entrance, waiting for the gates to unlock. There's no chaos here, not yet, but there's an order, and it's not coming from the guards. Before we go any further, drop your location in the comments. It's how this community stays connected. If this kind of true story resonates with you, like the video, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who won't look at prisons the same way again. The kid doesn't know it yet, but he's already been noticed. Two men standing near the phones haven't looked directly at him, but they've clocked every movement he's made since he arrived. They know his charge. They know his county. They know whether he's worth approaching, or whether he's a problem that needs to be handled before it grows. This is how it starts. Not with violence. Not with threats. Just with observation. In a place like this, information is currency. And the men who control the flow of information control everything else. The system before the syndicate. To understand the Texas Syndicate, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand the vacuum it filled. In the early 1970s, the Texas prison system was collapsing under its own weight. Facilities built for a few thousand inmates were holding tens of thousands. The Texas Department of Corrections wasn't just overcrowded, it was medieval. Inmates were packed into dormitories where privacy didn't exist. Violence was common, expected, and often ignored by officers who were outnumbered 50-1. But the real problem wasn't the conditions. It was the power structure, or the lack of one. For decades, Texas prisons had operated under what was called a building tender system. In simple terms, certain inmates were given authority over others. They weren't guards, but they acted like them. They carried weapons. They enforced rules. They kept the peace. Or at least, they kept things quiet enough that the administration didn't have to deal with it. These building tenders were almost exclusively white inmates, often serving life sentences for violent crimes. They were chosen by the guards, given privileges in exchange for control. If you wanted a job assignment, a cell transfer, or protection from other inmates, you went through them. If you crossed them, you paid for it. For white inmates, this system worked. For black and Hispanic inmates, it was a different story. By the mid-1970s, nearly 60% of the Texas prison population was Hispanic, mostly from the borderlands San Antonio, El Paso, the Rio Grande Valley. These men came from neighborhoods where loyalty was everything, where family ties extended beyond blood, where respect wasn't given. It was earned and defended. Inside the system, they had none of that respect. They were at the bottom of a hierarchy. They had no say in building. The building tenders treated them as labor, as problems, as bodies to be managed. The administration didn't care. As long as the violence stayed internal, as long as it didn't make headlines, the system kept running. But systems like that don't last. They crack. And when they do, what comes next is usually worse. California sends a message. The spark that ignited the Texas Syndicate didn't come from Texas. It came from California. In 1957, a group of Hispanic inmates inside Folsom State Prison formed what would become the most powerful prison gang in American history, the Mexican Mafia, also known as La Im. They didn't start as an army. They started as a survival mechanism, a way for Chicano inmates to protect themselves from the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black guerrilla family, and the chaos of California's overcrowded prisons. But La Im grew fast. By the 1970s, they controlled drug trafficking, extortion, and violence inside nearly every major prison in California. If you were Hispanic and you went to prison in California, you either paid La Im, joined La Im, or you became a target. Their influence didn't stay inside the walls. They reached into the streets, controlling drug corridors, taxing dealers, ordering hits on people who'd never set foot in a prison. They were organized. They were ruthless. And they were expanding when Hispanic inmates from California started getting transferred to Texas prisons, often after being caught in federal cases or for violating parole. They brought that culture with them. They brought the tattoos, the codes, the structure. They brought the idea that prison didn't have to be a place where you just survived. It could be a place where you built power. But Texas wasn't California. The Tejano, Texas-born Hispanic inmates, didn't trust the Californians. They didn't like their attitude. They didn't like the way La Im tried to tax them, to demand loyalty from men who didn't owe them anything. The Tejano had their own pride, their own neighborhoods, their own codes. They weren't going to bow to outsiders, even if those outsiders had a reputation. So in the mid-1970s, inside the walls of California's Folsom prison, a small group of Tejano inmates made a decision. They weren't going to join La Im. They were going to create something of their own. They called it the Texas Syndicate. At first, it was just a name, a way to say, we're not with them, we're with each other. But names have a way of becoming real. And once the Texas Syndicate had a name, it needed rules. It needed structure. It needed to prove it could survive. The birth of a code. The men who founded the Texas Syndicate understood something fundamental. If you're going to survive as an organization inside a prison, you can't just be violent. You have to be disciplined. Violence without structure is chaos. Chaos gets you locked down. It gets you transferred. It gets you isolated in administrative segregation where you can't build, can't recruit, can't operate. The founders of the syndicate had watched other groups fall apart because they couldn't control their own members. They'd seen gangs turn on themselves, implode from within, get dismantled by snitches and informants. So they built the syndicate on a foundation of rules, not suggestions, not traditions, rules that were enforced without exception, without mercy. The first rule was loyalty. Once you were in for life. There was no resignation letter, no retirement plan. You didn't leave the syndicate because you got out of prison. You didn't leave because you moved to another state. You didn't leave because you wanted to go straight. The only way out was death, yours or the organization's. The second rule was silence. You didn't talk to cops. You didn't talk to guards. You didn't cooperate with investigations, even if it meant adding years to your sentence. Snitches weren't just expelled, they were eliminated, and not quickly. The syndicate had a reputation for making examples, for ensuring that betrayal was met with something worse than death. Public humiliation, prolonged suffering, and a message sent to everyone else. The third rule was respect. Not the kind of respect that comes from fear, though fear was part of it. This was respect built on action. You didn't demand it. You earned it. You proved yourself through loyalty, through discipline, through your willingness to do what needed to be done when it needed to be done. And the fourth rule, the one that separated the syndicate from every other gang in the system, was this: no drugs. Not for personal use. Not while you were a member. The syndicate controlled drug trafficking inside the prisons. It was one of their primary sources of income, but members couldn't use. The logic was simple. Addicts were unreliable. They talked too much. They made mistakes. They became liabilities. This wasn't a street gang. This wasn't a loose collection of criminals who happened to wear the same colors. The Texas Syndicate was an organization. It had a hierarchy. It had leadership. It had soldiers, prospects, and associates. Every member had a role. Every role had expectations. At the top was the president, sometimes called the chairman. He made the final decisions on major moves, wars with other gangs, alliances, internal discipline. Beneath him were captains who ran operations inside individual prisons. Below them were lieutenants and sergeants who managed day-to-day activities, coordinated drug trafficking, collected debts, and ensured that the rules were followed. And at the bottom were the soldiers, men who hadn't yet proven themselves fully, but were willing to do whatever was asked. These were the ones who carried out the violence, the ones who took the risk, the ones who, if caught, would take the fall without saying a word. It was a machine, and like any machine, it required constant maintenance. Weak links were identified and removed. Mistakes were corrected. Power was consolidated. By the time the syndicate made its way back to Texas in the late 1970s, it wasn't just an idea anymore. It was an institution. The expansion. When the Texas Syndicate returned to their home state, they arrived with a blueprint. They knew how to operate. They knew how to recruit. And most importantly, they knew how to stay invisible until they were too strong to dismantle. The first facilities they infiltrated were the ones where Tejano inmates were concentrated, places like the Ramsey Unit, the Caulfield Unit, and the Darrington Unit. These weren't the maximum security fortresses that would come later. They were general population facilities, places where inmates mixed, where movement was possible, where you could build networks without constant surveillance. The syndicate didn't announce themselves. They didn't paint murals or wear colors. They operated through whispers, through quiet conversations in the law library, through coded letters sent between facilities. If you were from the right neighborhood, if you knew the right people on the outside, if someone vouched for you, you might get approached. You might get tested. The test wasn't complicated. It was simple. Prove you're loyal. Maybe that meant holding on to contraband during a shakedown, knowing that if you got caught, you'd take the charge without mentioning who it belonged to. Maybe it meant delivering a message to another inmate, one that couldn't go through official channels. Maybe it meant standing next to someone during a fight, even if you barely knew them, because they were syndicate and that meant they were family. If you passed the test, you became an associate. You weren't a full member yet, but you were on the path. You had access to certain protections. If someone came at you, the syndicate would come at them. If you needed something, a phone card, commissary items, a weapon, the syndicate could provide it. But you owed them, and debts to the syndicate were never forgotten. By the early 1980s, the Texas Syndicate had cells in nearly every major prison in the state. They weren't the largest gang. Not yet. The Aryan Brotherhood and the Mexicani, another Hispanic gang with roots in Texas, both had significant numbers. But the syndicate was different. They were disciplined. They didn't start wars they couldn't win. They didn't draw unnecessary attention. They built their power slowly, carefully, like a foundation you couldn't see until the building was already standing. And then the system handed them an opportunity. In 1980, a federal judge named William Wayne Justice issued a ruling that would change Texas prisons forever. The case was Ruiz versus Estelle, and it exposed decades of abuse, neglect, and constitutional violations inside the Texas Department of Corrections. Overcrowding, inadequate medical care, brutal discipline, and most importantly for what was coming, the building tender system. Judge Justice ordered the state to dismantle the building tenders. No more inmates policing other inmates. No more weapons in the hands of prisoners. The guards would have to actually guard. The administration fought it. They appealed. They delayed. But by the mid-1980s, the building tender system was gone, and the vacuum it left behind was massive. For decades, the building tenders had maintained a brutal but functional order. Violence happened, but it was controlled. Drugs flowed, but through regulated channels. Power was centralized. When the tenders were removed, that centralization disappeared. Suddenly, every gang, every clique, every group of inmates with shared interests was competing for the same space. The Texas Syndicate was ready. They'd been preparing for this moment, whether they knew it or not. While other gangs scrambled, fought chaotic wars, and made themselves visible to the administration, the Syndicate moved with precision. They identified weak targets, inmates who owed debts, who dealt drugs without protection, who operated independently. They offered two options: pay taxes to the syndicate or face consequences. Most people paid. Those who didn't became examples. The taxation economy. Inside the Texas prison system, money doesn't work the way it does outside. You can't walk into a store. You can't use a credit card. Everything flows through commissary, the prison store where inmates can buy food, hygiene products, and small luxuries with funds deposited into their account by family or earned through prison jobs that pay pennies per hour. But commissary isn't the real economy. It's just the visible one. The real economy is underground. It's the trade in contraband, drugs, cell phones, tobacco, weapons, pornography, anything that's prohibited but desired. And like any economy, it has taxes, protection fees, licensing costs, the price you pay to do business. The Texas Syndicate didn't invent the system, but they perfected it. By the mid-1980s, if you wanted to sell drugs inside a Texas prison, you had two options. You could operate independently, which meant you were vulnerable to robbery, assault, or being reported to the guards by a competitor. Or you could operate under syndicate protection. If you chose protection, the terms were clear. You paid a percentage of your profits, usually 20 to 30%, directly to the syndicate. In exchange, you got security. No one would rob you. No one would undercut your prices. If someone tried, the syndicate handled it. You also got access to supply chains. The syndicate had connections on the outside, family members, associates, sometimes even corrupt guards who could smuggle product into the facility. If you ran out, they could resupply you. If you got transferred, they could set you up at the next spot. It was organized crime in its purest form. Supply, demand, enforcement, and profit. But the taxation system extended beyond drugs. Gambling operations paid taxes. Inmates who ran stores, selling items stolen from the kitchen or acquired through corrupt guards, paid taxes. Even protection itself was taxed. If you were a vulnerable inmate, someone serving time for a sex offense, someone who cooperated with police in the past, someone who just couldn't handle themselves, you could pay the syndicate for protection from other predators. It wasn't cheap, but it was cheaper than the alternative. The money didn't just stay inside the prison. A portion of it flowed out, sent to the families of incarcerated syndicate members, used to pay lawyers, used to fund operations on the street. The syndicate wasn't just a prison gang anymore. They were becoming something bigger, a criminal organization that existed on both sides of the wall. And that meant they needed to protect their interests aggressively. The first major war. Peace in prison is always temporary. By 1985, the Texas Syndicate had established dominance in several facilities, but they weren't the only organization growing. The Mexicani, sometimes called the Texas Mexican Mafia, had been operating even longer. They were larger, more aggressive, and increasingly frustrated by the syndicate's rise. The two groups had coexisted for years, sometimes uneasily, sometimes through mutual agreements to stay out of each other's way. But as both organizations expanded, their territories began to overlap. Disputes arose. Small at first, arguments over drug debts, disrespect between members, competition for recruits. The kind of friction that, in another context, might have been resolved with a conversation. But in prison, friction doesn't de-escalate. It builds. The spark came in 1986, inside the Ramsey unit. A Mexicani member accused a syndicate associate of stealing from him. A few commissary items, nothing major. The associate denied it. Words were exchanged. Insults, threats, the kind of confrontation that happens 100 times a day in any prison. But this time, neither side backed down. The Mexicani member went to his leadership. He wanted the issue addressed. He wanted the syndicate associate disciplined, or at least an apology. The syndicate leadership refused. They didn't believe their guys stole anything. And even if he did, they weren't going to let the Mexicani dictate terms. It escalated. A week later, the Mexicani member was attacked in the shower. 3 syndicate soldiers surrounded him, armed with shanks, prison-made knives fashioned from sharpened metal, plastic, or glass. The attack was fast, brutal, and efficient. The victim survived, barely, spending weeks in the prison hospital with collapsed lungs and internal bleeding. The Mexicani had a choice: let go or respond. They responded. 2 days after the attack, a syndicate captain was ambushed in the day room. For Mexicani members rushed him with weapons. He fought back. These men always fought back, but he was outnumbered. By the time the guards intervened with pepper spray and batons, the captain was on the ground, bleeding from multiple stab wounds. He died before they could get him to the infirmary. That death changed everything. It wasn't just a retaliation anymore. It was war. Both organizations issued orders to their members across the state. No more coexistence. If you see them, you hit them. It didn't matter if you were friends before. It didn't matter if you had no personal issue with them. Loyalty to the gang superseded everything. Over the next 6 months, violence spiked across the Texas prison system. Stabbings in the yard, ambushes in the chow hall, assaults during transfers. The administration responded with lockdowns, with transfers, with segregation. They broke up known gang members, sent them to different units, tried to sever communication. It didn't work. The Syndicate and the Mexicani had structures that couldn't be broken by simple transfers. They had leaders on the outside coordinating moves, passing messages through visitors, through corrupt guards, through coded letters. The war continued, just in different locations. By the time a fragile truce was brokered in 1987, negotiated through intermediaries, with both sides exhausted and facing severe crackdowns from the administration, dozens of inmates had been stabbed, several had died, and both organizations had solidified their reputations as forces that couldn't be ignored. The Texas Syndicate had proven they could fight, and more importantly, they'd proven they wouldn't be pushed around. Life under the blue. To the outside world, the Texas Syndicate was invisible. They didn't appear on news broadcasts. They didn't have spokespeople. Most people had never heard their name. But inside the walls, everyone knew. Inmates identified Syndicate members by subtle markers, tattoos usually, the letters TS, inked somewhere on the body, often hidden from guards but visible to other inmates. Some members wore more elaborate designs. Tejano imagery, symbols of Texas pride, cultural markers that signaled loyalty to their roots. But the Syndicate was careful. They didn't advertise like some gangs did. No massive back pieces, no facial tattoos that screamed affiliation. Discretion was survival. For a full member, life inside the Syndicate meant structure. You woke up knowing your role. You had responsibilities, collections to make, messages to deliver, new inmates to evaluate. You attended meetings, usually during recreation time or in cells where privacy could be maintained. These weren't casual conversations. Agendas were set. Problems were discussed. Decisions were made collectively, though final authority always rested with leadership. Discipline was absolute. If you were ordered to carry out a hit, you did it. No questions. No hesitation. If you were ordered to hold contraband, take a charge, or lie to investigators, you complied. Refusal wasn't an option. Refusal was betrayal. And betrayal had only one outcome. But the Syndicate also took care of its own. If your family on the outside needed money, the organization provided it. If you needed a lawyer, they helped fund your defense. If you were transferred to a new facility, you arrived with connections already in place. Someone would reach out, make sure you were situated, make sure you weren't vulnerable during those first critical days. It was a family in the most literal sense. Dysfunctional, violent, bound by rules that outsiders would never understand, but a family nonetheless. For men who'd grown up with nothing, who'd been abandoned by the system, who'd never had stability or loyalty in their lives, the Syndicate offered something they'd been searching for, belonging. But that belonging came at a cost. The outsiders. Not everyone in the Texas prison system was affiliated with a gang. In fact, most weren't. There were the independents, inmates who kept their heads down, did their time, avoided politics. Some had short sentences and saw no benefit in getting involved. Others were older, had already done decades, and wanted nothing to do with the chaos. They stayed neutral, navigated carefully, and hoped to be left alone. Then there were the vulnerable ones. The inmates serving time for crimes that, even in prison, carried a stigma. Sex offenses, crimes against children, cooperation with law enforcement. These men lived in constant danger. They couldn't be independent. They needed protection. And that protection had to be purchased, usually from one of the larger gangs. And then there were the ones who refused to play the game. The ones who believed they could walk through prison without bending, without paying, without acknowledging the power structures around them. These were the ones who lasted the shortest. A man named Marcus learned this the hard way. He'd arrived at the Caulfield unit in 1987 with a 15-year sentence for armed robbery. He was 24, from Houston, and he'd never been to prison before. He'd heard the stories. Everyone had, but Marcus believed he was different. He was strong. He could handle himself. He didn't need anyone's protection. For the first few weeks, he kept to himself. He worked his assigned job in the laundry. He stayed out of the yard politics. When other inmates approached him, friendly at first, feeling him out, he brushed them off. He didn't want to owe anyone anything. He just wanted to do his time and go home. But in prison, neutrality is a lie. Silence is interpreted as disrespect. And disrespect, if left unchecked, is permission. One afternoon in the chow hall, Marcus sat alone at a table, eating quickly so he could return to his cell. 2 syndicate members approached. Not aggressively, just casually, like they were making conversation. They asked where he was from, what part of Houston, who he knew. Normal questions, the kind you get asked 100 times when you first arrive. Marcus answered, but he kept it short. He didn't offer more than what was asked. Then one of them asked a real question. You riding with anybody? Marcus said no. He wasn't riding with anyone. He was good on his own. The 2 men exchanged a glance. One of them smiled, nodded, and said, All right, homie, just checking. They walked away. Marcus thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, Marcus returned to his cell after work to find it had been ransacked. His commissary was gone. His personal property, letters from home, photos, a small radio he bought, had been taken or destroyed. His mattress had been slashed open, the stuffing pulled out and scattered across the floor. He reported it to a guard, who told him there was nothing they could do. Theft happened. He could file a grievance, but it wouldn't bring his stuff back. Marcus understood the message. This was a test. He was being pressed hard to make a decision, align with someone or keep getting targeted. He didn't align. He stayed independent, convinced he could outlast the pressure. 2 weeks later, Marcus was attacked in the shower. 3 men, no weapons, just fists and boots. They didn't kill him. That wasn't the point. The point was to break him, to show him that his independence was an illusion. When he was released from the infirmary a week later, Marcus made a decision. He approached a syndicate member he'd seen around, someone who'd been in one of those initial conversations. He didn't say much. He just asked what he needed to do. The syndicate member smiled. You should have asked sooner. Marcus became an associate. He paid his taxes. He did what he was told. And for the rest of his sentence, no one touched him. That's how it worked. You could resist, but resistance had a shelf life. Eventually, everyone made a choice. The way to the walls. The Texas Syndicate still exists today. Not in the same way it did in the 1980s and 90s, when it was at its peak, when it controlled entire facilities, when its reach extended into the streets, when its name alone carried weight that could shift the balance of power inside any prison in the state. The system has changed. Increased surveillance, gang intelligence units, solitary confinement wings designed specifically to isolate leaders. The administration learned, slowly, how to fracture these organizations. Not by destroying them, but by making it harder for them to operate with the precision they once had. But the syndicate adapted. They always have. Today, they operate in the shadows of an even more surveilled world. Communications are coded. Leadership rotates to avoid detection. Membership is smaller, more selective, more cautious. They've learned that survival doesn't come from being the biggest or the loudest. It comes from being the most disciplined. And the cycle continues. New inmates arrive every day. Young men from the same neighborhoods, facing the same choices, searching for the same sense of belonging that drove the founders of the syndicate decades ago. Some will choose independence. Some will align with other groups. And some will find themselves drawn to the structure, the loyalty, the promise of protection that organizations like the Texas Syndicate still offer. Because the one thing that hasn't changed, the thing that no amount of policy reform or increased security can eliminate, is a fundamental truth of prison itself. When you strip people of their freedom, when you put them in an environment where violence is currency and loyalty is survival, they will organize. They will build power structures. They will create order out of chaos, even if that order looks like chaos to everyone else. The Texas Syndicate didn't create that reality. They just learned how to navigate it better than most. This story isn't about glorifying crime or violence. It's about understanding the systems that produce them. It's about recognizing that prisons are microcosms of the larger society, places where inequality, desperation, and the human need for connection collide in ways that are often tragic, sometimes brutal, and always complicated. The men who join gangs like the Texas Syndicate aren't monsters. They're human beings who made choices, often terrible choices, within impossible circumstances. Some of them will spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Some will get out and try to rebuild. Some won't make it out alive. But their stories matter. Not because we should forget what they've done, but because understanding how they got there might help us prevent the next generation from following the same path. If this story made you think differently about prisons, about gangs, about the people who end up inside those walls, share it. Talk about it. Because these conversations are how change starts. And if you made it this far, thank you for listening. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you want to hear next. This is just one story. There are thousands more waiting to be told. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, the truth is never as simple as it seems.